They did a version of Stairway that had a choir and an orchestra, and then after the guitar, well, it was with the...
At 81 years old, Jimmy Page may still be the mystical wizard of rock, but beneath his majestic riffs and dragon-emblazoned robes lies a man who carried more guitar grudges than a high school band audition gone wrong. For decades, Page has been idolized as the sonic architect of Led Zeppelin's thunderous legacy, a perfectionist who didn't just play music, but summoned it from ancient realms with his double-necked axe. But behind the scenes, whispers always followed him. Whispers of backhanded comments, studio walkouts, and cold shoulders that froze entire green rooms. While Page rarely threw punches in public, his sharp tongue behind closed doors could slice faster than his iconic solo in Stairway to Heaven. In truth, the rock community was never just peace, love, and leather pants. It was a battlefield, and Jimmy wielded his disdain like a flaming sword. From theatrical stage warriors to flamboyant finger-tapping phenoms, Page silently waged war on anyone who, in his eyes, distorted the sacred soul of guitar playing. Some were friends turned foes, others never knew they'd crossed a line. But all had one thing in common. They triggered something deep in Page's perfectionist core, a sense that his vision of guitar purity was under siege by gimmicks, noise, or sheer arrogance. What emerges isn't just a list of names, but a hidden war between musical ideologies. While the world crowned him a guitar god, Page kept a mental list of heretics who, in his eyes, desecrated the temple. And what happened next would rattle the amp stacks of rock history, as we reveal the 6 guitarists who most infuriated the man behind the Zeppelin. When it comes to guitar rivalries, few are as deliciously dramatic as the unspoken Cold War. Between Jimmy Page and Deep Purple's riff-swinging knight, Ritchie Blackmore. On paper, they were kindred spirits, British virtuosos shaping the thunderous tones of hard rock. But behind the echo chambers and leather jackets, Page reportedly viewed Blackmore less as a fellow pioneer and more like a cosplay enthusiast who wandered into the temple of tone carrying a plastic sword. Every song needs a bloody sword fight. Page allegedly snapped to a group of studio musicians, mocking Blackmore's theatrical obsession with medieval themes and gothic stage antics. Where Page saw mysticism as a tool for mood and atmosphere, he accused Blackmore of treating concerts like Renaissance fairs with distortion pedals. The real sore point, according to insiders, wasn't just the theatrics, it was the substance. Page, a master of layering, dynamics, and sonic tension, resented what he perceived as Blackmore's show-over-substance style. One quote, "Never," confirmed publicly but widely whispered, had Page fuming. There are guitarists who serve the song, and there are guitarists who make the song serve them. Many believe that dart was hurled directly at Blackmore's ego from across the English Channel. The tension escalated during a London session in 1974 when Blackmore showed up unannounced. Page, upon seeing him, allegedly turned heel and told his roadie, "I don't have time for costume parties." Savage. What made it worse was that Blackmore, ever oblivious or cleverly passive, continued to praise Zeppelin in interviews, fueling Page's internal fire with every compliment. In truth, Blackmore's very existence seemed to irritate Page like a plectrum caught in his strings, not because he lacked talent, but because he flaunted it in a way that Page found, quite frankly, cheesy. Flashy boots, dramatic solos, and that whole medieval minstrel aura clashed hard with Page's vision of guitar as sacred storytelling, and thus Ritchie earned his place as the first name on a list of 6 that made Jimmy's amplifier scream, and not in a good way. If Ritchie Blackmore poked Jimmy Page's patience, then Eddie Van Halen straight up karate kicked it through the amp stack. When Van Halen's debut album detonated onto the scene in 1978, it wasn't just fans who were left with their jaws on the floor. It was every veteran guitarist who suddenly looked down at their fretboard and asked, "Are we obsolete now?" Eddie's two-handed tapping, blazing speed, and acrobatic showmanship blew open a new chapter in guitar history. But for Jimmy Page, it wasn't a revelation. It was a revolution he never asked for. According to insiders, Page was less than thrilled with Eddie's flashy style, allegedly calling it parlor tricks and circus show nonsense in a London pub filled with studio engineers. One quote, "sharp as a whammy bar bend," reportedly spilled from his lips. Real guitar. Playing comes from the heart, not from showing off like a circus performer. Oof. It didn't take long for those words to echo across the Atlantic, right into Eddie's ears. Ironically, Eddie often cited Page as an early influence. Talk about your musical heartbreak. But influence aside, the tension between the blues-rooted mystic and the finger-tapping phenom was more than generational. It was philosophical. Page built his legacy on gritty soul, harmonic tension, and moody atmosphere. Van Halen, on the other hand, was speed, smiles, and swagger, what Page allegedly dismissed as athletic guitar and bedroom noodling. One studio witness recalled that Page abruptly ended a conversation when someone dared mention the Eruption solo, mumbling something about having heard enough bedroom workouts for one lifetime. To the outside world, it looked like a simple case of old guard versus new school. But deep down, Page feared that the raw emotional grit of guitar music was being drowned by a tidal wave of tapping, shredding, and stage flips. Eddie's success symbolized a future where feeling might lose to flash. And for Jimmy Page, that was a chord he refused to play. If Eddie Van Halen's guitar gymnastics gave Jimmy Page a headache, then Yngwie Malmsteen's arrival must have felt like a full-blown migraine in the key of E minor. Bursting onto the scene in the 1980s like a powdered wig gladiator with a Stratocaster, Yngwie didn't just play fast, he played furious. With a swagger matched only by the volume of his solos, the Swedish shred wizard declared himself the greatest guitarist of all time before most of the world had learned to pronounce his name. To the media, he was a neoclassical genius. To Jimmy Page, a peacock with a PhD in self-promotion and a questionable understanding of blues. Behind closed doors, Page reportedly bristled at Yngwie's antics, once joking at a charity event, "This Swedish peacock thinks Bach wrote power chords." Ouch. But the real sting came from deeper wounds. Yngwie's elaborate scale runs and orchestral arrangements, while technically stunning, were, in Page's traditionalist view, musical theater with no emotional ticket. He reportedly called it classical music assault, where the guitar became less of a storyteller and more of a metronome on caffeine. Industry insiders claim Page felt personally insulted by Malmsteen's dismissal of blues-based rock, as if decades of Soul, Sweat, and Zeppelin had been reduced to primitive noodling. The final straw may have been at a 1988 Guitar Expo, where Page reportedly walked out mid-performance muttering to security, "I don't need to watch someone practice scales for 20 minutes." Malmsteen, never one to miss an opportunity to stoke a fire, later clapped back by branding Page's catalog as outdated blues jams. The clash wasn't just about style, it was about philosophy. Where Page saw guitar as sacred ritual, Yngwie treated it like a gladiatorial sport. And for a man who believed music should breathe, evolve, and ache, watching Malmsteen blaze through fretboards like a caffeinated Baroque composer felt like a personal insult carved in 16th notes. Thus, the Swedish Tornado earned a permanent spot on Jimmy Page's mental blacklist, no feathered cape required. When Jimmy Page and Keith Richards crossed paths, it wasn't a jam session, it was a philosophical bar fight in slow motion. Both were pillars of British rock, both worshipped at the altar of the blues, but they built their temples with wildly different blueprints. Page constructed sonic cathedrals filled with mysticism, layered arrangements, and sweeping crescendos. Richards? He built a dingy roadhouse and cranked the amp to 11. Their feud was less about personal insults and more about existential disdain. Page, ever the meticulous architect, reportedly rolled his eyes at Richards' three-chord swagger, allegedly telling a sound engineer, "Keith thinks 5 chords make him Chuck Berry. The man wouldn't recognize a melody if it bit him on his weathered arse." Woof! That line, dripping with sarcasm and salt, allegedly reached Richards within days. And if there's one thing Keith hates more than sobriety, it's being underestimated. What followed was a years-long Cold War between Zeppelin's celestial grandiosity and the Stones' gritty garage groove. Page viewed Richards as the poster child of what he called riff recycling, accusing him of stumbling through the same 3 licks for decades. Meanwhile, Richards saw Page as an overpolished wizard casting spells no one asked for. Things came to a head at Madison Square Garden in 1975 when witnesses claim Richards refused to shake Page's hand backstage, allegedly muttering, "I don't shake hands with thieves," a stinging jab at Zeppelin's notorious reputation for borrowing blues standards without always returning the receipt. The animosity was so thick, you could slice it with a guitar pick. Page, in turn, reportedly referred to Richards' catalog as boozy riff repetition and dismissed the Stones' stripped-down ethos as primitivism hiding behind a groove. The feud wasn't just about ego, it was about identity. To Page, the guitar was a sacred vessel for sonic exploration. To Richards, it was a blunt object you hit the world with until it danced. Neither backed down and neither forgot. And so, in the war between rock's shaman and its outlaw, there was no truce, only distortion. If there was ever a name that haunted Jimmy Page like an echoing wah-wah pedal in a dark rehearsal room, it was Jimi Hendrix. Though Hendrix's time in the spotlight was tragically short, his shadow loomed over Page's entire career like a towering amp stack no one dared move. Their feud, if you could call it that, wasn't built on direct insults or stolen bandmates. It was born out of something far more personal, insecurity. When Hendrix exploded onto the London scene in 1967 with a guitar on fire and feedback that sang like the gods, Page, then still carving his niche through Yardbirds residue and session gigs, reportedly felt swept aside by a psychedelic tidal wave. According to rock historians, Page allegedly confided to close friends, "This American comes over here and suddenly everyone forgets who was playing guitar before he arrived." And there it was, the wound. Hendrix wasn't just talented, he was revolutionary. While Page spent years mastering layered production, blues mysticism, and occult aesthetics, Hendrix won over audiences by plugging in, turning up, and letting chaos do the talking. Page reportedly dismissed it as controlled noise, saying, in one bitter interview, "Some people think breaking guitars makes you a genius. Real musicians don't need pyrotechnics." But that wasn't the whole story. Behind the barbed quotes was a man quietly wrestling with being upstaged. Not just on stage, but in history. Even after Hendrix's untimely passing in 1970, Page allegedly continued to undercut his legacy in private, calling it overrated theater, and suggesting that Hendrix was more myth than musician. Meanwhile, Hendrix had reportedly never spoken ill of Page, creating a painful irony. The feud may have been one-sided, a mirror reflecting Page's deepest doubts about his place in the pantheon. And perhaps that's why this rivalry still lingers in whispers. Because when a legend like Page sees his reflection in another's spotlight and it burns too bright to ignore, the resentment doesn't die, even when the other man does. Among all the names etched onto Jimmy Page's personal blacklist, none carved deeper wounds than the man once called God by his own fans, Eric Clapton. What began as a rivalry over blues riffs and studio gigs quietly erupted into a full-blown war of artistic pride, personal betrayal, and silent vengeance that stretched over decades. In the mid-1960s, the London blues scene was small, sweaty, and competitive, and both Clapton and Page were elbowing for the same scraps: session jobs, producer attention, and the crown of Britain's guitar elite. Page, ever the innovator, reportedly sneered at Clapton's reliance on blues standards, allegedly telling studio mates, "Eric plays the same 3 licks and they worship him. I guess mediocrity sells better than imagination." That barb sliced through the scene like a bent note in a quiet bar. But the real firestorm came later, when Clapton recruited drummer Jim Gordon, Page's longtime collaborator, without warning. Page, blindsided and livid, allegedly raged to close confidants. Eric builds his career on other people's talent because he doesn't have enough of his own. This wasn't just about music anymore. It was war. Throughout the 70s, as Zeppelin and Clapton both hit superstardom, the tension only grew. Page was crafting sonic epics with occult undertones. Clapton was strumming stripped-down blues with commercial polish. One insider claimed that Page privately mocked Clapton's entire approach, branding him a blues museum curator who hasn't had an original thought in his life. The insults weren't one-sided. Clapton allegedly dismissed Zeppelin's sound as bloated and overwrought, once claiming in an interview that he preferred the honesty of a single guitar line to Zeppelin's wall of noise. The final insult came at a private party, where Page, wine in hand, reportedly declared, "The difference between Eric and me, I make music, he copies it louder." For a feud that never exploded in public, it left enough broken strings behind the curtain to fuel a lifetime of resentment. In the eyes of Jimmy Page, Clapton wasn't just a rival. He was the ultimate imposter crowned in applause, and that, above all, was unforgivable. At first glance, Jimmy Page's 6 most notorious rivalries might seem like a laundry list of ego bruises and backstage pettiness. But dig deeper, and a more haunting truth emerges. These weren't just grudges. They were reflections of a man battling for the soul of his instrument. Page didn't just hate showboaters or scorn fellow legends out of spite. He saw himself as a gatekeeper of a sacred art form, and every flashy solo or blues shortcut felt like a chisel against the monument he'd spent decades building. Each guitarist on that list represented something that threatened Page's deeply personal vision of what music should be: emotional, intentional, mystical. Ritchie Blackmore, with his Renaissance theatrics, mocked the idea of restraint. Eddie Van Halen's fretboard gymnastics turned soulful melodies into circus stunts. Yngwie Malmsteen redefined precision as performance, while Keith Richards, the ragged poet, embodied raw simplicity Page often found lazy. Then there was Hendrix, the cosmic comet who didn't just challenge Page, he eclipsed him. And finally Clapton, the blues poster boy, whom Page believed coasted on safe licks and borrowed brilliance. In the quiet space between interviews and studio sessions, Page reportedly shared his fears with close confidants, that rock was losing its soul, that the guitar was becoming a toy, that the magic was being drowned by volume and vanity. These rivalries weren't always mutual. In fact, some of these men admired Page, even thanked him publicly. But to Jimmy, admiration didn't erase what they stood for. Each one was a mirror, reflecting what he believed the guitar should never become. And that's why these grudges endured. Not because of personal insults or career overlap, but because Page couldn't let go of the deeper war. A quiet, relentless fight to protect the meaning of music in a world that was rapidly trading poetry for pyrotechnics. The 6 men on his hate list weren't just competitors, they were symbols of change. And Jimmy Page? He wasn't ready to watch his religion turn into entertainment. In the end, Jimmy Page's hidden feuds were never really about volume wars or who could solo the fastest. They were about identity, legacy, and the unrelenting fear of being forgotten in a world that worships the next big thing. While the public saw a calm, mysterious virtuoso cloaked in dragon suits and drenched in reverb, behind the curtain was a man quietly measuring himself against 6 other names he could never quite escape. Blackmore, with his theatrical flair. Van Halen, with his athletic flash. Malmsteen, with his classical fury. Richards, with his raw minimalism. Hendrix, with his immortal chaos. Clapton, with his blues-washed mainstream charm. Each one chipped away at Page's sense of mastery in their own way, and each left a scar that shaped the kind of artist and protector he became. But the real twist? Maybe these rivalries needed to happen. Maybe it was the very presence of these musical antagonists that kept Page's creativity sharp and his standards higher than most could reach. Because what's a god without a challenge? What's an innovator without imitators to resent? These 6 guitarists may have drawn his scorn, but they also drew out his best. And as the amps quiet and the lights dim on a career that defined generations, one question still lingers louder than any solo. Was Jimmy Page preserving the soul of rock? Or was he just another legend unable to share the throne? That's the part only you can decide. So, tell us, which of these 6 rivalries surprised you the most? Was Page justified in his silent fury, or did his own perfectionism blind him to the beauty of evolution? Drop your thoughts in the comments, hit that like button if you felt the tension, and subscribe for more music legends exposed, one riff at a time. Because behind every icon is a secret list. And today, You just read Jimmy Page's.